The October rain fell steadily on Riverside Cemetery, turning the freshly dug earth into dark mud that clung to my black dress shoes. I stood at the edge of the small gathering, watching raindrops slide down the polished granite headstone that read Robert Mitchell, beloved father. The irony wasn't lost on me. My sister Catherine stood on the opposite side of the grave, her designer umbrella keeping her perfectly dry while the rest of us lesser mortals got soaked. She wore sunglasses despite the gray sky, probably to hide whatever emotion she was or wasn't feeling. At 35, she still carried herself like the prom queen she'd been in high school, all confidence and calculated movements. "Not much of a turnout," whispered my Aunt Patricia, nudging me with her elbow. She was right. Besides Catherine, myself, and a handful of Dad's old work colleagues, there were maybe 12 people total. For a man who'd lived 73 years, it felt pathetically small. The pastor cleared his throat and began his generic eulogy. I'd given him the bare minimum of information when he'd asked about Dad's life. What was I supposed to say? That Robert Mitchell had been a master at pushing people away? That he'd spent the last 15 years of his life alienating everyone who'd ever cared about him? I found myself studying the faces of the mourners, wondering how many of them actually knew my father beyond his reputation as a successful insurance broker. Mrs. Henderson from next door dabbed her eyes with a tissue, but I suspected that was more about the rain than grief. Tony Carlson from Dad's office kept checking his phone. Even the pastor seemed eager to wrap things up. The ceremony lasted 20 minutes. As people began to disperse, shaking hands and offering hollow condolences, Catherine finally approached me. She pulled off her sunglasses, revealing eyes that were completely dry. "Well, that's that," she said, folding her umbrella with a sharp snap. "I have to say, I'm surprised anyone showed up at all." "Catherine." "What?" "I'm being honest." She glanced around at the departing mourners. "Look at this, Nathan. 12 people. Whoa. And half of them probably came for the free coffee at the reception." I wanted to argue with her, to defend Dad somehow, but the words wouldn't come. She wasn't wrong. The man we'd just buried had died alone in his house, and it had taken 3 days for anyone to notice. If Mrs. Henderson hadn't seen newspapers piling up on his porch, who knows how long he would have stayed there. "The lawyer wants to meet with us tomorrow," I said, changing the subject. Catherine's expression shifted slightly, something calculating flickering in her eyes. "About the will?" "I assume so." "Good. The sooner we can wrap this up and move on, the better." She started walking toward the parking lot, her heels clicking against the wet pavement. "I'll see you at Morrison and Associates at 2 o'clock. Don't be late." I watched her climb into her silver BMW and drive away, leaving me standing alone next to our father's grave. The rain had softened to a drizzle and most of the other cars had already left. In the distance, I could see the groundskeepers waiting patiently with their shovels. My phone buzzed. A text from my wife Lisa. "How did it go? Call me when you're ready." I typed back, as expected. "Heading home soon." But I didn't move. Instead, I found myself staring at the headstone again, reading those words, "Beloved Father." Catherine had insisted on the inscription, though I suspected it was more about appearances than sentiment. Our father had many qualities, but beloved wasn't one that came readily to mind. Robert Mitchell had been a complicated man. Successful in business, meticulous with his finances, and absolutely terrible at human relationships. After Mom died 8 years ago, he'd become even more withdrawn. Family gatherings became awkward affairs filled with long silences and criticisms disguised as advice. Catherine had stopped visiting him altogether about 5 years ago, after what she called the final straw, though she'd never told me exactly what that meant. I'd kept up sporadic contact, mostly out of obligation. Duty calls every few months, brief visits that left both of us feeling uncomfortable and eager for them to end. The groundskeepers were approaching now, their shovels ready. I took one last look at the grave and walked to my car. As I drove through the quiet streets of suburban Chicago, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Dad's story than any of us knew. Tomorrow's meeting with the lawyer would probably be straightforward: divide up whatever assets existed and close this chapter of our lives. But something nagged at me. Maybe it was the way Catherine had looked when I mentioned the will, or maybe it was just the general strangeness of the whole situation. Our father, who'd been so careful about everything else in his life, had died without anyone knowing he was sick. Without anyone knowing he was struggling. Without anyone knowing he was alone. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a moment, watching the rain streak down the windshield. Lisa appeared in the front window waiting for me. She'd been patient through this whole ordeal, understanding when I'd had to take time off work to handle the funeral arrangements, supportive when I'd struggled with my complicated feelings about Dad's death. As I walked to the front door, I made a mental note to ask the lawyer some questions tomorrow. Not about the will necessarily, but about Dad's final years. Maybe I was giving myself false hope, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there were pieces of the puzzle I was missing. The front door opened before I could reach for my keys. "Hey," Lisa said softly, pulling me into a hug. "You look exhausted. It's been a day. Tell me about it." So I did. Over dinner, I described the sparse funeral, Catherine's cold demeanor, and the strange emptiness I felt about the whole thing. Lisa listened without judgment, asking questions when appropriate and offering comfort when needed. "Maybe tomorrow will give you some closure," she said as we cleaned up the dishes. Maybe. But even as I said it, I had the distinct feeling that tomorrow would raise more questions than it answered. Morrison and Associates occupied the third floor of a glass office building in downtown Chicago. The waiting room had the kind of expensive furniture that was meant to impress clients while remaining completely uncomfortable. Catherine was already there when I arrived, checking her phone and looking impatient. "You're 3 minutes late," she said without looking up. "Traffic." She made a noise that might have been acknowledgement or dismissal. We sat in silence until a secretary appeared and led us down a hallway lined with law books and framed diplomas. George Morrison looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a small-town lawyer: gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a suit that had seen better decades. His office smelled like old leather and coffee. He gestured for us to sit in chairs across from his desk. "Thank you both for coming," he said, settling into his chair with a slight grunt. "I know this has been a difficult time." Catherine crossed her legs and leaned back. "Let's just get this over with." Morrison raised an eyebrow but opened a thick folder. "Very well. As you know, your father's will is relatively straightforward. The house, his savings account, and his investment portfolio are to be divided equally between his 2 children." "What's the total value?" Catherine asked. "Approximately $420,000 after debts and taxes." Catherine nodded, apparently satisfied. I found myself wondering why Dad had accumulated so much money if he'd had no intention of enjoying it. "However," Morrison continued, "there are a few unusual elements to discuss." "Unusual how?" I asked. Morrison adjusted his glasses and pulled out a separate document. "Your father left specific instructions regarding his personal effects and papers. Everything in his office is to go to Nathan exclusively." Catherine's head snapped up. "What? Why?" "The will doesn't specify a reason. It simply states that all documents, files, and personal items in Robert Mitchell's home office are to be given to Nathan Mitchell." I felt a chill run down my spine. Dad's office had always been off-limits when we were kids. Even as adults, he'd never let either of us in there. "That's ridiculous," Catherine said. "What could possibly be in there that's worth anything?" Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "There's more. Your father also left a sealed letter for Nathan, with instructions that it should be read privately before any of the office materials are examined." He slid an envelope across the desk. My name was written on it in Dad's careful handwriting. Catherine stood up abruptly. "This is garbage. Equal division means equal division. I want to contest this." "You're certainly within your rights to do so," Morrison said calmly. "However, I should mention that your father was very specific about this arrangement. He came in 6 months ago to make these changes, and he was quite insistent about the details." 6 months ago? I looked up from the envelope. "He changed his will 6 months ago?" "Yes. Previously, everything was to be divided equally with no special provisions." Catherine was pacing now, her composure finally cracking. "So you're telling me that Dad decided, in the last months of his life, to give Nathan some kind of special inheritance?" "It appears so." She turned to me, her eyes blazing. "What did you do? What did you say to him?" "Nothing. I barely spoke to him." The envelope felt heavy in my hands. "Catherine, I had no idea about this." "Right. Sure you didn't." Morrison cleared his throat again. "Perhaps you'd like to take the letter home and read it privately, Nathan. The office materials can be collected at your convenience." Catherine grabbed her purse. "This isn't over. I'm calling my lawyer." She stormed out, leaving me alone with Morrison and the envelope. The lawyer looked tired. "Your father was a complicated man," he said. "But he seemed very certain about what he wanted." I drove home in a daze, the envelope sitting on the passenger seat like a small bomb waiting to explode. Lisa was at work, so I had the house to myself. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my name written in Dad's handwriting. Finally, I tore it open. "Nathan," it began, If you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've learned about my final wishes. I know this must seem strange and unfair to Catherine, but I had my reasons. I paused, my heart racing. There are things about our family that you don't know. Things I've kept hidden because I thought it would protect everyone. I was wrong. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, and it's better that it comes from me, even if I'm not here to explain it in person. My hands were shaking now. In my office you'll find files that explain everything. About your mother's illness, about Catherine's behavior in the final years, and about why I made the choices I did. I know you think I died alone, son. But you're wrong about that. I had to stop reading. The words were blurring together. You were the only one who kept trying. Even when I pushed you away, even when I made it difficult, you kept calling. You kept visiting. You kept caring. Catherine gave up on me years ago and she had her reasons, but you never did. I leaned back in my chair, my mind reeling. The office key is taped under the kitchen sink, left side. What you find there will be difficult to read, but it's important that you know the truth. And Nathan? Thank you for not giving up on me. I love you, son. I should have said it more often. It was signed simply, Dad. I sat there for a long time, holding the letter and trying to process what I just read. Catherine's anger suddenly made more sense. She must have sensed that there were secrets, even if she didn't know what they were. But what could be so important that Dad had restructured his will 6 months before his death? What truth was he talking about? I looked at the clock. Lisa wouldn't be home for 3 hours. I had time to drive to Dad's house and see what was waiting for me in that office. The key was exactly where he'd said it would be, taped under the kitchen sink in a small plastic bag. As I held it, I realized that this was the first time in 15 years that I would see inside Robert Mitchell's private sanctuary. The office door was solid oak, and the key turned smoothly in the lock. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was exactly what I'd expected, meticulously organized, with filing cabinets lining the walls and a large desk in the center. What I hadn't expected was the wall of photographs behind the desk. Dozens of them, all of me. Pictures of me as a kid at school events playing baseball. Photos from my wedding that I didn't remember him taking. Recent pictures of me and Lisa that must have been taken with a telephoto lens from across the street. But it was the filing cabinet labeled Family that caught my attention. I pulled it open with trembling hands. Inside were folders with our names: Nathan, Catherine, Margaret, my mother's name. I pulled out Catherine's folder first. What I found inside changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Catherine's file was thick, much thicker than mine or Mom's. The papers were organized chronologically, starting from about 10 years ago. The first document was a police report. I had to read it twice before it sank in. Catherine had been arrested for embezzlement from her accounting firm. The charges had been dropped, but only because Dad had paid full restitution, nearly $50,000. My hands shook as I flipped through more documents. Bank statements showing regular transfers from Dad's account to Catherine's. Court documents for a civil lawsuit that had been settled out of court. More payments. Always more payments. There was a letter from Catherine, handwritten and desperate. Daddy, I know I messed up again. But this time it's different. If you don't help me, I'll lose everything. The house, my car, my reputation. Please. I promise this is the last time. The letter was dated 3 years ago. I sat down heavily in Dad's chair, Catherine's file spread across the desk. The pattern was clear now. For years, she'd been coming to Dad whenever she was in trouble, and he'd been bailing her out. Embezzlement, gambling debts, tax problems, it was all here, documented in Dad's careful handwriting. The most recent entry was from 18 months ago. A letter from Dad to Catherine, but this one was different. His handwriting was shaky, angry. Catherine, this is the last time. I've given you over $200,000 over the past decade, and you've learned nothing. You continue to lie, to steal, to manipulate everyone around you. I'm done enabling this behavior. Don't contact me again unless you're ready to get serious help. Attached to the letter was a copy of Catherine's response, apparently saved from an email. Fine. Have it your way. Die alone, old man. See if I care. I felt sick. This was why Catherine had stopped visiting. Not because Dad had pushed her away, but because he'd finally stopped being her personal ATM. I put her file aside and opened mine. It was much thinner, mostly containing school records, newspaper clippings from my high school baseball team, wedding photos, and copies of the Christmas cards Lisa and I sent every year. But at the bottom was a section labeled Visits. Dad had kept a log. Every phone call, every visit, every interaction we'd had over the past 8 years since Mom died. The entries were brief but detailed. Nathan called to check on me. Invited me for Christmas dinner. I declined but appreciated the gesture. Nathan stopped by today. Brought groceries even though I told him not to. He's worried about me living alone. Nathan called about the furnace repair. Offered to pay for it. I refused but was touched by his concern. The entries went on and on, dozens of them. I remembered most of these interactions, but I'd always felt like Dad was tolerating my visits out of obligation. Reading his notes, I realized he'd been grateful for every one. The most recent entry was from just 2 weeks before he died. Nathan visited today. I wasn't feeling well and was probably rude to him. He brought soup from that deli downtown and insisted on staying until I ate some of it. I don't deserve such a good son. I had to stop reading. The tears were making it impossible to see the words clearly. I opened Mom's file next, expecting more financial records or medical documents. Instead, I found love letters. Dozens of them, written by Dad to Mom over the course of their 30-year marriage. They were beautiful, poetic, nothing like the distant man I remembered. But at the bottom of the file was a section that made my blood run cold. Medical records from Mom's final illness, but not the version we'd been told. According to these documents, Mom hadn't died of cancer as we'd believed. She'd taken her own life. There were psychiatrists' notes, hospital records, and a suicide note that I'd never seen. In her final letter, Mom wrote about her depression, her fear of being a burden, and her desperate wish that her children would remember her as she'd been before the illness. Dad had covered it up. He'd worked with the doctors and the coroner to change the cause of death, to spare Catherine and me the pain of knowing the truth. He'd carried that secret alone for 8 years. I was still processing this revelation when I heard a car in the driveway. Through the office window, I could see Catherine's BMW pulling up to the house. She got out and marched toward the front door with the determination of someone who'd come for a fight. I quickly gathered the files and locked them in Dad's desk drawer. By the time Catherine let herself in with her key, I was sitting in the living room trying to look casual. "Nathan? I know you're here. I saw your car. In here." She appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with anger. "I want to know what's in that office." "Catherine, maybe we should talk about this later?" "No. We're talking about it now." She sat down across from me, her eyes hard. "I know Dad left you something that explains why I was cut out of his will. I want to know what it is." I studied my sister's face, seeing her clearly for the first time in years. The desperation hiding behind the anger. The guilt she was trying to mask with indignation. "Why did you stop visiting Dad?" I asked. The question caught her off guard. "What does that have to do with anything? Just answer me. Why did you stop coming around?" She shifted uncomfortably. "He was impossible to deal with. Always criticizing, always judging. I got tired of it." "That's not the whole truth, is it?" Her composure cracked slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean there was more to it than that. Something specific happened between you two." Catherine stood up abruptly. "I don't have to listen to this. Just tell me what Dad left you and we can both move on." But I was done with the lies and the half-truths. Our father had spent years covering up family secrets, and it had cost him his relationship with one daughter and nearly cost him his relationship with me. He kept records, Catherine. Of everything. Her face went white. "What kind of records?" "The embezzlement. The gambling debts. The $200,000 he gave you over the years." She sank back into her chair as if someone had cut her strings. "He told you about that?" "He documented all of it. Every loan, every bailout, every lie you told him." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I never meant for it to go that far." "Which part? The stealing or the lying?" "Any of it." She looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw vulnerability instead of calculation. "It started small. I made some bad investments, got in over my head. Dad offered to help, and I told myself it was just temporary. But it wasn't. No, it wasn't. Every time I promised myself it would be the last time, but then something else would happen. Another mistake, another crisis. And Dad would fix it, so I never had to face the real consequences. I thought about the pattern I'd seen in the files. Until 18 months ago." She nodded miserably. "He said he was done enabling me. That I needed to take responsibility for my own life. So you cut him off." I was angry. And embarrassed. And terrified that you'd find out what kind of person I really was. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I told myself he deserved to be alone after the way he'd treated us growing up. But that wasn't the whole story either, and we both knew it. Dad hadn't been perfect, but he'd loved us in his own complicated way. Catherine had chosen to see only his flaws because it made her own behavior easier to justify. He kept visiting logs, I said quietly. Every time I called or stopped by. He was grateful for every conversation, every gesture. Even when I thought he didn't want me there. Catherine closed her eyes. I know you were the good son, Nathan. You don't have to rub it in. I wasn't trying to be good. I was just trying to stay connected. And I gave up. Her voice broke completely now. I gave up on him and he died thinking I hated him. We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the living room windows. This house, which had felt so empty and unwelcoming during Dad's final years, suddenly felt full of ghosts and regrets. There's something else, I said finally. About Mom. Catherine looked up sharply. What about Mom? I told her about the medical records, about Mom's suicide, about Dad's decision to hide the truth from us. With each word, Catherine's face grew paler. She killed herself, she whispered. And Dad never told us? He thought he was protecting us. Jesus. Catherine put her head in her hands. No wonder he was so messed up after she died. He was carrying that secret alone. Along with all your secrets too. She flinched at that but didn't deny it. I made his last years hell, didn't I? I wanted to lie to make her feel better, but we'd had enough lies in our family. You made them harder than they needed to be. Catherine started crying then, really crying for the first time since Dad's death. Not the performative tears she'd shed at the funeral, but raw, ugly sobs that came from years of suppressed guilt and shame. I moved to sit beside her on the couch and put my arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me, and for a moment we were just two siblings mourning their complicated father and trying to make sense of the wreckage of their family. I can't take any of it back, she said through her tears. No. You can't. So what do I do now? That was the question, wasn't it? Catherine had spent years running from consequences, and Dad had enabled that behavior until it nearly destroyed both of them. But he was gone now, and she was left to figure out how to live with what she'd done. You start by telling the truth, I said. To yourself, to me, to anyone else who needs to hear it. And then you do better. You get help if you need it. You take responsibility for your choices. You stop running. She nodded, wiping her nose with a tissue. Will you help me? It was a loaded question. Catherine had burned a lot of bridges over the years, and trust didn't rebuild itself overnight. But she was still my sister, and Dad's files had shown me something important. Even people who make terrible choices can change if they're willing to do the work. I'll help you, I said. But this time you have to do the actual work. I know. We sat there as the room grew dark, both of us lost in our thoughts. Tomorrow we'd have to figure out the practical details of Dad's estate, deal with Catherine's legal issues, and begin the long process of healing our relationship. But tonight, for the first time in years, we were just family. As I prepared to leave, Catherine asked one more question. Do you think he forgave me? At the end? I thought about Dad's files, about the careful way he documented everything, about the love letters to Mom and the proud records of my visits. Robert Mitchell had been many things, but he hadn't been cruel. If he'd wanted revenge against Catherine, he could have exposed her secrets years ago. I think he hoped you'd find your way back to him, I said. And I think he never stopped hoping. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but maybe it was something better. Maybe it was love that endured even when everything else fell apart. 3 months later, I stood in Dad's office again, but this time I wasn't alone. Catherine was there too, helping me sort through the remaining papers and decide what to keep and what to donate. The room looked different now. We'd removed most of the filing cabinets, and sunlight streamed through windows that had been covered by heavy curtains during Dad's final years. It felt like a normal room instead of a tomb. Look at this, Catherine said, holding up a photo I hadn't seen before. It showed the 4 of us at a family barbecue from maybe 15 years ago. Dad was actually smiling in it and Catherine was laughing at something Mom had said. We looked happy. I remember that day, I said. You brought that terrible potato salad. It wasn't terrible. It was creative. It had raisins in it, Catherine. And pickles. She laughed and the sound was lighter than it had been in years. Okay, it was pretty terrible. The past 3 months had been difficult but productive. Catherine had followed through on her promise to get help. She'd started seeing a therapist, joined a support group for people with gambling addictions, and was working on a plan to pay back the money she'd stolen from various sources over the years. It wasn't going to be easy or quick. Catherine had accumulated substantial debts, and her reputation in the accounting field was damaged beyond repair. She'd had to sell her house and move into a modest apartment, but she was working as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit and seemed genuinely committed to staying on the straight and narrow. More importantly, she was starting to be honest about her problems instead of hiding them. "I found something interesting yesterday," I said, pulling out a folder I'd set aside. "It's about the house." Catherine looked up from the photo. "What about it?" "Dad left instructions with Morrison about what to do with it. Apparently he wanted it sold and the proceeds split between us, but he had a specific request about the timing." "What kind of request?" I opened the folder and showed her a letter in Dad's handwriting. "He wanted us to live in it together for at least 3 months before making any decisions about selling it." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Live together? We haven't done that since high school." "I know. But he seemed to think it was important." She read through the letter, which explained Dad's reasoning. He'd hoped that spending time in the family home together would help us reconnect and work through our issues. He'd also left detailed instructions about how to handle the finances during those 3 months, including provisions to help Catherine get back on her feet. "Even after everything I did to him, he was still trying to take care of me," Catherine said quietly. "That's what parents do. Good parents do that. I'm not sure I would have been so generous." I thought about that. Catherine was probably right that she wouldn't have been as forgiving in Dad's position. But maybe that was part of why Dad had made these arrangements. He'd understood that forgiveness and reconciliation required structure and time, not just good intentions. "So what do you think?" I asked. "Want to be roommates for a few months?" Catherine considered it. "Lisa would be okay with this?" "We talked about it. She thinks it might be good for both of us." It had actually been Lisa's idea. She'd pointed out that Catherine was going to need support during her recovery, and that I was still processing my complicated grief about Dad. Living in the family home together might help us both find some closure. "Okay," Catherine said. "Let's try it." So we did. Catherine moved into her old bedroom, and I spent weekends at the house while continuing to live with Lisa during the week. It was awkward at first. We had to negotiate everything from household chores to grocery shopping, but gradually we fell into a routine. More importantly, we started talking. Really talking for the first time in years. Catherine told me about the gambling addiction that had started during her marriage and spiraled out of control after her divorce. She talked about the shame that had driven her to lie and steal, and about how Dad's enabling had made it easier for her to avoid facing her problems. I told her about my own struggles with Dad's emotional distance, about how I'd kept visiting him partly out of duty but also out of hope that someday we'd break through the barriers between us. I talked about the guilt I felt for not recognizing how much my visits had meant to him. We also talked about Mom, processing the revelation about her suicide and trying to understand why Dad had hidden the truth from us. Catherine thought he'd been wrong to lie to us, while I was more sympathetic to his desire to protect us from painful knowledge. "Maybe we were both right," Catherine said one evening as we sat on the front porch. "Maybe he was wrong to lie, but his reasons were understandable. People make mistakes when they're trying to protect the people they love." I agreed. Even when the protection causes more harm than good. We were both quiet for a moment, thinking about the ways our family had tried and failed to protect each other from difficult truths. "I keep wondering what would have happened if I'd been honest with him earlier," Catherine said. "If I'd told him about the gambling problem before it got so bad." "You can't change the past." "I know. But I think about it anyway." I understood that impulse. I'd spent plenty of time wondering what would have happened if I'd pushed harder to stay connected with Dad, if I'd recognized the signs of his isolation earlier, if I'd been more persistent about getting him help. But those were futile thoughts. The only thing we could control now was how we moved forward. One evening, about 2 months into our experiment in cohabitation, Catherine brought home a surprise. "I got a call from Morrison today," she said as we prepared dinner together. "Apparently Dad left one more thing." "What now?" She pulled out a small wooden box. This was in his safety deposit box. Morrison said it was specifically for both of us to open together. Inside the box were 2 smaller envelopes, one with each of our names. There was also a folded piece of paper with a note, "To be opened together on Catherine's 40th birthday or 6 months after my death, whichever comes first." 6 months is next week," I said. "Should we wait for my birthday?" "That's not until December." "I don't think I can wait that long." We sat down at the kitchen table and opened our respective envelopes. Inside mine was a key and a brief note. "Nathan, thank you for never giving up on our family. This key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Box 247. Use what you find there to build something better than what we had." Catherine's envelope contained a similar key and a longer note. "Catherine, I know you think I stopped loving you when I stopped giving you money. That was never true. I love you enough to want better for you than a life built on lies and quick fixes. The contents of box 346 are yours only if you've been sober and honest for at least 6 months. Nathan will know whether you've met this condition. I trust his judgment and yours. We stared at each other across the table. He left us more safety deposit boxes? Catherine asked. Apparently. And he's making me prove I've changed before I can access mine. Are you angry about that? Catherine considered the question. I should be. But honestly, it's probably what I need. Accountability. The next week we went to the bank together. Both boxes contained substantial amounts of cash and investment documents, but they also contained letters explaining Dad's intentions. My box included enough money to pay off my mortgage and start a college fund for the children Lisa and I were planning to have. But more than that, it included a letter explaining why Dad had never shown affection easily and asking me to break that cycle with my own family. Catherine's box contained enough money to pay off her debts and start fresh, but it came with conditions. The money was held in a trust that would release funds only as she met certain milestones in her recovery. It was Dad's final attempt to help her without enabling her. He really thought of everything, Catherine said as we sat in the bank parking lot. He had a lot of time to plan. And he knew us better than we knew ourselves. That was probably true. Dad had understood that Catherine needed structure and accountability to succeed, and that I needed permission to break free from his emotional patterns. Even in death he was trying to parent us. 6 months after moving in together, Catherine and I decided to sell the house. We'd accomplished what Dad had hoped, we'd reconnected as siblings and found a way to support each other through our respective healing processes. The closing was on a Friday in late spring. As we signed the papers, I thought about all the memories that house contained, both good and difficult ones. We were selling more than just a building. We were letting go of our childhood and our parents' complicated legacy. After the closing, we drove to Riverside Cemetery. It had been almost a year since Dad's funeral, and the grave site looked established now, with grass growing over the previously fresh earth. We'd brought flowers, nothing fancy, just daisies from the grocery store. As we arranged them by the headstone, Catherine spoke to Dad for the first time since his death. "I'm sorry it took me so long to figure things out," she said. "And thank you for not giving up on me even when I gave up on myself." I added my own words. "Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. And thank you for showing me that it's never too late to try to make things right." We stood there in comfortable silence for a while, watching other visitors tend to their own family graves. The cemetery was peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, nothing like the grim, rainy place it had been during the funeral. "I keep thinking about what you said at the funeral," I told Catherine as we walked back to the car. "What did I say?" "That he died alone." Catherine stopped walking. "Nathan, I'm sorry about that. I was angry and hurt and I said something cruel." "No, that's not what I mean. I keep thinking about it because you were wrong." She looked confused. "He didn't die alone, Catherine." "Not really." "Yes, he was physically alone in that house, but he was carrying all of us with him. Mom's memory, your struggles, my visits, even your anger. We were all there in that office, in those files, in those photographs." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "You think so?" "I know so. People don't document their love for others the way Dad did unless that love is the most important thing in their lives. We weren't absent from his final years. We were the reason he kept going." As we drove away from the cemetery, Catherine asked what I was planning to do with my share of Dad's final gift. "Lisa and I are thinking about buying a house with a big backyard," I said. "Maybe starting that family we've been talking about." "And you'll do better than Dad did with the emotional stuff?" "I'll try." "What about you?" Catherine had been accepted into a master's program in nonprofit management. She wanted to use her accounting skills to help organizations that assisted people with addiction and financial problems. "I figure if I'm going to rebuild my life, I might as well make it count for something," she said. "Dad would be proud of that choice." "I hope so." We drove in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. The past year had been one of the most difficult of my life, but also one of the most important. I'd learned things about my family that had been painful to discover, but I'd also learned that love could survive secrets, mistakes, and even death. A few weeks later, Lisa and I found out she was pregnant. When I called Catherine to tell her the news, she cried happy tears and immediately started talking about being an aunt. "What are you going to name the baby?" she asked. "We don't know yet. We're still discussing options. If it's a boy, you should consider Robert." I was quiet for a moment thinking about that suggestion. "You think so?" I think Dad would like knowing that his name was going to be associated with a fresh start instead of all the complicated stuff he left behind. And if it's a girl? Margaret, after Mom. The good parts of Mom, the parts that loved us and wanted us to be happy. 8 months later, Robert Nathan Mitchell was born on a sunny Tuesday morning in October. Catherine was the first person we called after my parents, and she cried when I told her his name. Lisa and I brought baby Bobby home to a house with the big backyard I dreamed of, purchased with Dad's gift and filled with furniture that Catherine had helped us pick out. It felt like the beginning of something new and hopeful. On Bobby's first Christmas, Catherine came to stay with us for a week. She'd been sober and honest for over a year now, and she'd found her footing in graduate school. More importantly, she'd found a way to forgive herself for the mistakes of her past while still taking responsibility for them. As we sat by the Christmas tree watching Bobby sleep in his bassinet, Catherine said something that surprised me. I dream about Dad sometimes. Good dreams where we're all together and nobody's angry or hiding anything. What do you think he'd say if he could see us now? Catherine considered that question seriously. I think he'd say we finally figured out how to be a family. She was probably right. Robert Mitchell had spent his final years trying to hold our family together through documentation and financial support, through secrets and sacrifices. But it had taken his death for Catherine and me to learn how to actually connect with each other. 2 years later, when Lisa was pregnant with our second child, Catherine was accepted for a job running a financial literacy program for a major nonprofit. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that someone who'd struggled with money management for so long was now helping others avoid the same mistakes. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility? I asked her over dinner. I'm sure. And if I'm not ready, I'll get the help I need to become ready. That's what healthy people do, right? That's what healthy people do. I thought about that conversation as I drove home that night. Catherine had become someone I genuinely liked spending time with, not just someone I felt obligated to maintain contact with. She was funny and thoughtful and honest about her struggles in a way that made her easier to trust. But more than that, she'd learned to ask for help when she needed it instead of trying to manipulate people into giving her what she wanted. It was a fundamental change that had transformed not just our relationship, but her entire approach to life. On the second anniversary of Dad's death, Catherine and I returned to Riverside Cemetery with our spouses and Bobby, who was now a toddler with Dad's serious eyes and Mom's smile. As we arranged fresh flowers by the headstone, I realized that this had become a tradition for us, not out of obligation, but because we genuinely wanted to remember Dad and share his story with the next generation. Bobby toddled over to the headstone and patted it gently, the way he did with everything he was curious about. Catherine laughed and scooped him up. "Hi, Grandpa," she said to the stone, holding Bobby so he could see it too. "This is your grandson Bobby. He's going to grow up knowing that families can heal from difficult things, and that love is stronger than secrets." As we prepared to leave, I noticed an elderly man tending a nearby grave. He looked familiar, and after a moment I realized he was Mr. Patterson, one of Dad's former colleagues who'd attended the funeral. "Excuse me," I called out to him. "Mr. Patterson?" He looked up and smiled. "Nathan Mitchell. How are you, son?" "I'm well, thank you. I didn't expect to see you here. I come by every few months to visit my wife," he said, gesturing to the grave he'd been tending. "But I always stop by your father's grave too." That surprised me. "You do? Your dad was a good man, Nathan. Complicated maybe, but good. A lot of us at the office knew he was struggling in those final years, but he was proud. Wouldn't let anyone help him." "You tried to help him?" "We all did in our own ways. Invited him to retirement parties, asked him to lunch, tried to include him in things. He usually said no, but we could tell he appreciated being asked." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. Even at work, Dad had been surrounded by people who cared about him, but he'd been too proud or too damaged to let them in. "He wasn't as alone as we thought he was," Catherine said quietly. Mr. Patterson nodded. "That's right. Your father touched a lot of lives over the years. Maybe he didn't know how to show it, but he was loved by more people than he realized." As we walked back to our cars, I thought about Mr. Patterson's words. Dad had spent his life believing he was protecting his family by carrying our burdens alone, but he'd also been protecting himself from the vulnerability that comes with letting people help. It was a pattern I recognized in myself, the tendency to handle problems independently rather than asking for support. But becoming a father had taught me that isolation wasn't strength, it was just another form of fear. "I don't want Bobby to grow up thinking he has to handle everything by himself," I told Lisa that night as we put him to bed. "Then we'll teach him that asking for help is brave, not weak," she said. And that families work better when everyone tells the truth, even when the truth is difficult. Especially then. 3 years later, our daughter Margaret was born. Maggie, we called her, after the grandmother she'd never meet but whose love letters we'd someday share with her. Bobby was fascinated by his baby sister and appointed himself her protector, a role he took very seriously. Catherine was Maggie's godmother, a decision that would have seemed impossible during the dark years of our family's history. But she'd earned that role through years of consistent change and growth, and both Lisa and I trusted her completely with our children's well-being. The day of Maggie's baptism, as our extended family gathered in the church where our parents had been married, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 4 years ago, Catherine and I had barely been speaking. Now she was an integral part of my children's lives and one of my closest friends. After the ceremony, as we celebrated at home with Catherine, Lisa's parents, and a few close friends, someone raised a toast to family. To the Mitchells, Catherine said, lifting her glass. The living and the dead, the perfect and the flawed, the ones who never gave up on love even when love was complicated. To second chances, I added. To truth-telling, Lisa contributed. To families that heal, Catherine finished. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and the children were asleep, Catherine lingered on the front porch with Lisa and me. I have something to tell you, she said, and for a moment my heart skipped a beat. Despite all her progress, I still worried sometimes about relapses or setbacks. What is it? I've been seeing someone. His name is Tom, and he's a counselor who works with people in recovery. We met at a conference 6 months ago. Catherine, that's wonderful, Lisa said. Why do you look nervous about telling us? Because I'm thinking about marrying him. I stared at my sister, trying to process this information. Catherine hadn't had a serious relationship since her divorce 8 years ago, and she'd been very focused on her career and recovery. Are you sure you're ready for that? I asked. I think so. We've been taking it slowly and we've talked about everything. He knows about my past, about the gambling and the financial problems and all of it. And he still wants to build a life with me. Then I'm happy for you, I said, and I meant it. There's more. We want to have kids. That was a bigger surprise. Catherine had never shown much interest in motherhood, but people change and she'd certainly proven that over the past 4 years. How do you feel about that? Lisa asked. Terrified and excited in equal measure. But I think I'm ready to try to be the kind of mother I wished I'd had, honest, present, supportive without being enabling. You'll be a great mother, I said. Look how good you are with Bobby and Maggie. That's different. Being an aunt is fun and easy. Being a mother is the hardest job in the world. It is, Lisa agreed. But it's also the most rewarding. Catherine and Tom were married the following spring, in a small ceremony in Dad's old backyard. We'd sold the house, but the new owners were happy to let us use the space for the wedding. It seemed fitting somehow, a celebration of new beginnings in the place where our family had started to heal. Bobby served as ring bearer, taking his job very seriously and walking down the aisle with the kind of concentration he usually reserved for building blocks. Maggie, now walking and getting into everything, was the flower girl, though she was more interested in eating the petals than scattering them. As Catherine and Tom exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to be honest with each other even when honesty was difficult, I thought about how proud Dad would have been to see this day. 2 years later, Catherine gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl she named David and Sarah. I was one of the first people she called from the hospital. Nathan? They're here. They're perfect. And I'm absolutely terrified. That sounds about right for new parenthood. Will you and Lisa come meet them? I need my family here. We'll be there in 20 minutes. As Lisa and I bundled up Bobby and Maggie for their first trip to meet their new cousins, I marveled at how naturally Catherine had called us her family. Not her brother and sister-in-law, not her support system, but simply her family. That word meant something different to us now than it had growing up. Family wasn't just the people you were related to, it was the people who showed up for each other, who told difficult truths, who chose love even when love was complicated. Standing in the hospital room watching Catherine hold her newborn children with a mixture of wonder and determination, I realized that our father's greatest gift hadn't been the money he'd left us or the house we'd shared. It had been the example he'd set, imperfect and difficult, but ultimately rooted in love. Robert Mitchell had spent his final years trying to hold his family together through documentation and financial support, but he'd also planted seeds for the future. His insistence that Catherine and I live together after his death had forced us to confront our relationship and build something healthier. His truth-telling through those files had given us the foundation we needed to create a more honest family dynamic. Now, 7 years after his death, we were finally living the kind of connected, supportive family life he'd always wanted for us but hadn't known how to create. As I held baby David and watched Bobby gently pat baby Sarah's tiny hand, I made a silent promise to Dad. We would remember the lessons his life had taught us, about the importance of showing up, about the power of persistent love, about the courage it takes to tell the truth even when the truth is painful. But we would also do better than he had. We would ask for help when we needed it. We would say, "I love you" out loud. We would choose vulnerability over protection, connection over independence. We would honor his memory by building the family he'd always hoped we could be, not perfect but honest. Not without problems but willing to face them together. Not without pain but sustained by love that was stronger than fear. And maybe someday when Bobby and Maggie and David and Sarah were adults with families of their own, they would stand in another cemetery and tell their own children about the grandfather they'd never met but whose love had shaped their entire lives. The man who died surrounded by love, even when he couldn't see it. The father who'd never stopped believing that his family could heal, even when healing seemed impossible. The grandfather whose greatest gift was teaching us that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, but it endures anyway, passing from one generation to the next like a flame that never goes out. At the gravestone, my sister had laughed and said he died alone. But she was wrong. Robert Mitchell died surrounded by love, he just couldn't see it at the time. Now we could see it everywhere.